The annual legislative session in Florida begins Tuesday, just weeks after a special session passed immigration reform. What are the key issues the House and Senate will tackle? Clay County's Sam Garrison joins us as the future Speaker of the House. One of the key issues in Washington is getting support in Tallahassee, from customs and immigration enforcement to government efficiency. We're connecting the dots from D.C. to Florida's capital. Chris Hand breaks it down in our Hand on Government segments. All that on This Week in Jacksonville.
Thank you so much for being with us today. So we've got a little bit of a change, some technical issues. So Sam Garrison is not able to join us this morning. We're still going to get through some great topics, though, because Florida, whether Mr. Garrison was here or not, that 60-day legislative session each year, it begins soon. In odd years like 2025, it begins the first Tuesday of March. That means the opening gavel comes in 2 more days. So with us today, Chris Hand, who is a government law attorney, who's got plenty of experience both the local side, state, federal, and so I appreciate just jumping in here, coming right off the bench, and we'll do the whole show together. One of the things that we look at, and what I was going to talk to Representative Garrison about, just, hey, as we go into this regular legislative session, there have already been a couple special sessions. What should Floridians expect when we get to what's happening for lawmakers in Tallahassee this year?
Well, Ken, it's interesting. The legislative session each year is always a very big deal, but it's flown under the radar screen a little bit this year for a couple of reasons. One, the legislature's already spent a significant amount of time in Tallahassee this year with the special session they held last month to address the issue of immigration, and also because of all the news pouring out of Washington with the new administration. So this session is creeping in a little more quietly, but I think there's a variety of factors we can look at. One is more about sort of tone and approach, and then we can maybe talk about specific issues as well. I think, first of all, this is going to be a very different session than others we've seen before because of the relationship between the legislature and the governor. It is a time-honored tradition in Florida that different branches of the government, these co-equal branches of government, the executive branch led by the governor, the legislative branch led by the Senate President and the House Speaker, guard and defend their institutional prerogatives. So at times in that process, they cooperate and coordinate when possible, but at times they butt heads. We haven't seen that as much in recent years, but it came roaring back during this January special session.
It was stunning to many who went, what just happened here? Because Republican-led legislature and Republican-led executive branch, all of a sudden they were in conflict.
Well, just to be clear, that's really the regular order of things. When my former boss and mentor, Bob Graham, was governor from 1979 to 1987, it was a very common occurrence for him to have disagreements with the Democrats who controlled both the Senate and the House at that time, even though they were members of the same party, because they represented different perspectives, one executive, one legislative. So it was just the way things were that there were those occasional skirmishes between the branches of government. It's been different and surprising in the last 6 years that we really haven't seen much of that. But it did come roaring back in January at that special session where the governor called the special session, the legislature gavelled in and then immediately gavelled out, said this session is done. And now we're bringing in our own special session where they wrote their own immigration bill that was different than the one the governor had proposed, and overrode several spending vetoes he had issued at the end of last year's budget process. So that was the legislature very much sending a loud signal that in 2025 and beyond, they are going to defend their institutional prerogatives. They're not just going to sort of go along with the governor's recommendation. They're going to exercise some independent authority.
A power play of sorts for the legislature?
Well, I would less characterize it as a power play and more of a rebalancing of the relationship between the governor and the legislative branch. This governor has had a lot of success moving his agenda through the legislature over the last 6 years without a lot of legislative pushback. That is obviously ending this year. And that's probably for a number of reasons. I think number one, probably due to the experience and personalities of the legislative leaders, Ben Albritton in the Senate and Danny Perez in the House, both who are experienced and have clear visions for what they want to do in the legislature, but also because, as we know, in less than 2 years, Florida will have a new governor. In November 2026, we'll elect a new governor. That person will be sworn in January 2027. So it's not unusual when a governor reaches the end of his or her term to see a little bit of diminishment of their role in the process and the legislature kind of step up and take a bigger role. So I think just sort of thematically, Kent, we're going to see that through the session, but we're also going to see work on a variety of other issues. Another one that's, again, not necessarily a specific issue, but more theme, a number of these legislators endorsed Ron DeSantis when he ran for president in 2024. You're beginning to see a realignment of those legislators now trying to make it clear that they are aligned with President Trump, who won the Republican nomination and then the presidency. So we're already seeing legislation. Immigration was one. There'll be other examples where the renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America is a bill that's been introduced. So there will be some efforts to align with President Trump. We're going to see some controversial issues, for example, gun safety. After the Parkland shooting in 2018, part of the reform legislation that passed increased the age of people who could own certain types of guns like rifles from 18 to 21. There's a bill that would lower that back again. There's also a bill that would adopt what's called the open carry, where people can just sort of openly carry firearms in the state. The Senate President, interestingly, Ben Albritton, has already said that he will not support that because law enforcement has said it will not support that, and he stands with law enforcement. I think we'll also see some action on housing and housing affordability. That's obviously a huge issue still here in Florida, in the sense that, we had the condo incident at Surfside where the condo collapsed. State legislature put some new rules in place to try and ensure condo safety, but that has proven to be sort of an affordability problem for many condo buildings. Probably see some action on that. And also on the issue of parks. You might remember in the last few months, it was sort of revealed that there was an effort perhaps to put pickleball courts or golf courses or hotels on Florida's national treasures, right? Even right here in the First Coast, Anastasia Island State Park, right in the St. Augustine area. After a lot of bipartisan outcry, that idea went away. But Senator Gail Harrell has introduced legislation to make sure that doesn't happen again in the future, to ban those types of amenities from being put in state parks. As she puts it, those are natural treasures, and we should make sure Floridians can enjoy them for what they are. So those are just a few of the issues. There'll be a lot of others that come up in this session, but I really do think the dominant issue will be the relationship between the legislature and the governor, and we'll particularly see that, Kent, on the issue of the state budget. Governor DeSantis has introduced a $116 billion state budget.
Sounds like a lot, but...
Yeah, right. It is a lot of money, not necessarily compared to what the federal government budget is, but is a very significant size budget. We're the third largest state. In past years, the legislature has largely followed his lead. But this year they have signaled they're not going to do that. Under the state constitution, budget writing is their, again, institutional responsibility. They have authority to do that. And by overriding those vetoes in that special session, they were very clearly sending a message that they are going to adopt and lean into their responsibility this year. So governor's proposed a budget. I expect the legislature to rewrite that significantly. One part of that will be Senate President Albritton has made his top priority what he calls the Rural Renaissance Initiative, where he's going to, and he wants to invest $200 million in education, healthcare, and infrastructure in those 31 of 67 Florida counties that are considered rural in nature.
Yeah, half would affect half of the counties in the state. And we're just getting started here. So stay with us, Chris Hand. We continue our conversation, and we're going to look a little bit more at some of the state, local, and even the federal government issues and how they all are intertwined this year. That's next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville with Kent Justice.
And monthly, we talk with government law attorney Chris Hand. Chris, we're talking about the legislative session in the state of Florida, and we were just talking about budget. So budget really is job one for the lawmakers. They can't be done with the session until they have a budget. Is that accurate?
Well, that's right. It is the one matter that the state constitution prescribes must get done during the legislative session each year. And sometimes they've had to have special sessions to finish that process. But that is in the legislature's constitutional wheelhouse to pass a budget each year.
Well, and as I understand it, we were talking about the number, but Governor DeSantis' proposal for the budget, $115.6 billion or what have you, that actually reflects pulling back spending. And is that where the disagreement may come from Senate and House and what they want to do versus the executive branch?
Well, that may be one source of disagreement. I suspect there's going to be a lot of sources of disagreement in this process. You know, this is, I think, going to look a lot more like, again, it has in years past where, during the course of the DeSantis administration, when he's proposed a budget, that's really set the tone for the process from start to finish. You might remember very famously a couple of years ago, there was when he was signing the budget and issuing budget vetoes, he was vetoing some projects as the Senate president and House Speaker stood behind him and vetoing projects they cared about quite a bit. So I think the legislature this year wants to take a very different approach, whether it's on the total amount of spending or the types of spending. So the governor submitted a proposal. My sense is they'll now, thank him for that suggestion, and the appropriators in the Senate and the House will get together and do a lot of work on that budget. That budget will probably look somewhat different than the one the governor recommended. Now, it won't look totally different because I think both the governor and the legislature have similar budget priorities, but I think it will look different as they exercise their institutional prerogatives on the budget. Where the next real clash could come in is once the budget is passed and the governor is considering vetoes. He vetoed a lot of the budget in the last couple of years. In many of those years, the legislature did not return to overturn those vetoes. As we said in the previous segment, they have now indicated that they will. So I suspect that this session will not be the last session on the budget. If the governor has budget vetoes the legislature doesn't like, I think it is very possible they're coming back in special session to try and override those.
Well, I know we talked about there's some gun laws that may be changed here. The governors have been talking about tax cuts. It seems like many in the legislature say they're for that. One of the things is elections. There's an effort here on the Republican side or what have you to make it harder to get proposed constitutional amendments on the ballot. This seems like reaction to last year and the marijuana amendment, the abortion amendment, some of those things. Is that what's happening?
It is, although it's a little puzzling in the sense that because Florida has a very high threshold to pass constitutional amendments, 60% plus one, a supermajority as opposed to a simple majority, it makes amendments very difficult to pass, even amendments which are broadly popular. So, Kent, as you know, both the amendment to restore reproductive rights, abortion in the state constitution, and the one to allow recreational use of small amounts of marijuana received overwhelming support in the election, but they didn't reach that 60% threshold. So as a result, folks who opposed those amendments, which happened to include the governor, were successful, right? I mean, even though it had that broad-based support, they are not part of the state constitution, and advocates will have to come back in a future election. So I think there's a lot of questions about why put this additional measure on the Constitution when Florida already has a high bar. Of course, remember, constitutional amendments are one of the ways that citizens can sort of directly use their effective citizenship powers to try and put propositions on the ballot to be adopted in Florida law, in this case in the state constitution. So there's concern, given that Florida already has a heightened standard for passing constitutional amendments, that this would now make it even harder for citizens to exercise their rights and responsibilities to potentially change the state constitution.
Before we're done with this segment, I wanted to just point out the connection here between what's going on in Washington and now what's happening in Tallahassee and even some municipalities throughout the state. And that's this DOGE effort, this Department of Government Efficiency. We saw lots of movement in the first month of President Trump's administration, but we're also seeing now this week Governor DeSantis says we're going to do that in Florida as well. Do we expect a lot of that during this legislative session?
Well, there certainly will be some discussion of it because it is such a dominant national subject. I do think it's important, Kent, to sort of better define this concept of efficiency because it's called the Department of Governmental Efficiency. I know something about this because part of what I do for a living is work with a team to help local and state governments around the country achieve efficiency and improve efficiency in their government operations. That is very much a thoughtful process where you're diving deep into different agencies. You're most importantly talking to employees who are there because they often have the best ideas on how to make their operations more efficient. And most importantly, you're doing it with the goal of improving customer service, making sure that at the end of the day, the services that are being provided can be provided more effectively and more efficiently. The effort that's occurring in Washington, just based on the way it's played out so far, is less of an efficiency effort and more of a government elimination effort, sort of indiscriminately firing a variety of different federal employees, these probationary employees in different agencies, canceling federal leases and office spaces. And, Elon Musk, who's the head of the DOGE effort, has even said, hey, we're going to make mistakes in this process. Well, As a result, there have already been some government services compromised, some people who were fired who had to be rehired because they held key positions in the federal government. So it's really been less of an efficiency effort and more of an elimination effort. It remains to be seen which of those two tracks Florida's effort might move down.
Excuse me. Well, it's interesting, and we'll move on after this, but it's interesting because Governor DeSantis was talking about we need to be more efficient while spending the first 30 minutes of the news conference saying, look how efficient we are in Florida. So trying to understand what both sides of that are. Chris, don't go anywhere, and you don't go anywhere either. We're going to get hyper local when we come back. Chris walks us through the once again exploding debt for Jacksonville's police and fire pension fund. We'll also talk about JSO moving to Brooklyn next on This Week in Jacksonville.
You're watching This Week in Jacksonville on Channel 4.
And thanks so much for staying with us. We continue with government law attorney and author Chris Hand. Let's talk about City of Jacksonville, and there is pension debt again that is coming up here. So the debt for the pension fund, police and fire pension fund, more than $3 billion. The big question is, hey, didn't the city fix this during the current Curry administration? There was pension reform. Why is this a rising issue again?
Kent, as Yogi Berra would have said, it's deja vu all over again. That's really where we are. This is an issue the city's been dealing with for now almost 20 years, and it's something that multiple mayoral administrations, the Page administration, the Brown administration in which I served, we spent the entire 4 years working on pension matters. Mayor Curry's administration, now Mayor Deegan's administration. This pension issue is kind of just one that won't go away. And the news this past week has been, as Nate Monroe, the new executive editor of the Tributary, reported, the city's police and fire pension fund has released its annual actuary report, which shows for the first time the unfunded actuarial liability of that fund. In other words, that's the difference, Kent, between the amount of assets the city has on hand to pay benefits and the amount it owes in future benefits and unfunded liability. That amount is more than $3 billion now, which is the most it's ever been here in the city. The plan is only 44% funded, and that has an upward effect on the amount the city is going to have to pay in this budget for, contributions to that fund, more than $200 million. Again, sort of a record amount that's going into that. When you add that to the general employees pension plan, which has an unfunded liability of just under $2 billion and a payment each year of about $120 or so million, that's a very significant part of the city budget, Kent. And this is something that just keeps coming up. It's going to continue to be an issue for a couple of reasons, one of which is the city has recently agreed to allow some employees to go into the Florida retirement system. That tends to be a more expensive plan than the one the city has right now. So, and this is all happening in the context, Kent, as you know, of a time where cities and states around the country just have a lot less revenue than they used to, where all of them are battling deficits, trying to figure out how to cut spending, find efficiencies. Just last year, the city council auditor projected the city of Jacksonville would run an nearly $80 million deficit this year. We don't know what that updated projection is. Maybe it's gotten better, maybe it's gotten worse, but the city's really going to be in a budget cutting mode in the next several years. And at that time, this is kind of not great timing because at that time, these pension expenses are going up significantly. So it's going to make the city's budget challenges even just that much more difficult.
Let's talk about one of those things that eventually, if they build a new jail, we could talk about another $1 billion in the city of Jacksonville. But even so, the sheriff's office is moving its headquarters, just announced and confirmed through city council they're going to move over to the Florida Blue building in not Riverside, but the Brooklyn area.
Well, the sheriff's office has been looking for some time to depart their current headquarters, which is on Bay Street in downtown Jacksonville. It's an older building. They've sort of outgrown it. It's
almost
antiquated.
48 years old.
Sort of no longer suits their needs. And obviously their goal ultimately is to have a new jail built, not in downtown Jacksonville, somewhere else. But they want to keep their administrative headquarters in the downtown area. So they've been in talks for some time with Florida Blue to move the administrative headquarters to Florida Blue's building on Riverside Avenue in the Brooklyn neighborhood of downtown. That lease has now been consummated. It's a long-term lease. I think more than 10 years is ultimately what that lease length is going to look like. And the sheriff's administrative staff, where the sheriff and his teams will have their offices, will be in that building. But as you say, that is just step one of this process. That's the administrative building on Bay Street. Of course, right next to that is the Duval County Jail, and that's going to be one of the next big financial issues the city grapples with, how to pay with what some are projecting will be a $1 billion cost to build a new Duval County Jail. There's a lot of expenses on the city's plate right now, whether that's the cost of the new stadium, whether that's pensions, whether that's the amount the city's investing downtown, and now potentially this new jail. So in a fiscally challenging time, this is going to be a real balancing act for the city to figure out how it funds some of this infrastructure and key priorities, and may have to make some hard decisions about which priorities are going to come first and which ones may have to be deferred until later.
And in some ways, for everybody at home, I mean, this is like home ownership, because you know the price when you sign up and sign the papers for the mortgage, and then along the way you're going to have to replace the air conditioning unit or the dishwasher, or you just write on down the line there. And Chris, I appreciate it. I know that as you look at that, based on your experience, we can pretty much forecast that the folks in City Hall or in Council, that they're going to be having to look at this too. Thank you so much for your time today.
Kent, great to see you as always.
All right, thanks. And thanks for stepping in for the state representative as well.
Well, I'm sure you'll have him on a future show. Look forward to seeing that.
We sure will try to do that. And just around the corner, the players in Ponte Vedra, we're visiting with Tournament Director Lee Smith next time. Rick Mullaney, he'll also be with us. I'm Kent Justice. Thanks for watching on air on Channel 4 and the CW17, and then online at news4jax.com or streaming on News4Jax Plus. And don't forget to check out This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition, our podcast this week. We're looking at real estate and the exploding market in Clay County. You can find new episodes every Thursday at 9 a.m. You're going to find it right now on News4Jax Plus under the channel This Week in Jacksonville. You also find This Week in Jacksonville Business Edition available wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for joining us today.
See why every day more people are choosing News4Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.